Hello, and thanks for joining us for today's webinar titled Death, Taxes, and Backup Fingerpointing. Are These Inevitable? I'm Kevin Collins from Unitrans, and I'm here with Joe Noonan, Vice President of Product Marketing, and he'll be taking us through the presentation today. And don't forget, one lucky attendee will be walking away with a $100 Amazon gift card. We'll contact the winner via email after the webinar. But before we get started, I'd like to cover a few housekeeping items. This session will be recorded, and after the event, you'll receive an email with a link to the on-demand version of the webinar. I would also encourage you to ask questions as we go. You can do so by typing them into the Q&A box in the bottom right of the player. We'll answer all of your questions at the end of the session. At this point, I'll turn it over to Joe. Enjoy the presentation, and Joe, take it away.
Great, thanks, Kevin. Hopefully you can hear me okay. Thanks, everybody, for joining. Appreciate everyone's time. Hopefully I won't take too much of it, and if we're lucky, I'll have helped you understand a few things you can use to build your backup and continuity strategy, and maybe help you with some of the criteria that you can use to evaluate vendors in this space. So most of you probably know why you're here and why you actually care about this topic if you're sitting on here, but some people may have possibly just joined because they wanted to shop the Amazon gift card. So here's a little background on why the concept around backup vendor finger pointing is important. You know, it's pretty interesting is today, honestly, I talk to a lot of folks in your space, talk to a lot of customers, a lot of IT admins and prospects, and ultimately people don't really want to think about backup in my experience and what I hear from folks. I actually came from a virtual specific VM backup company called PHC Virtual, which was acquired by Unitrans a few years ago. And in my days back then, people really did care about backup because a lot of times it was the VM admin and they liked anything virtualization. So the more you could integrate with virtualization features and the cooler things you did around virtualization, they really kind of took to those things and really liked it. They liked getting into kind of the backup nuts and bolts. But honestly, those days seem to be gone. I talk to the same exact customers, people that are still customers here at Unitrans. And nowadays, you know, with the way things have changed, more critical applications have been virtualized for those folks. In the end, they just need to get production to work better, right? They need to get it to perform. They're worried about, you know, things being up and available. And they're obviously worried about making sure that if something does happen, they have a fail-safe in place, but really, I mean, a lot of their time is spent, and they want to spend it, and is really where they really want to spend it, not so much where they always spend it, but where they want to spend their time is on production and making things work better. So as a result, again, most people I speak with these days, they really don't have the time to think about backup. They want fewer vendors, more complete solutions that take less time to manage, and ultimately something that they know they can trust will work. So that's why obviously it's important to have a good backup software solution, right? And notice that I specifically talk about software there because I think the answer is sure, you always want to make sure you have good backup software, but an important component to remember here is that backup software is just one small piece of the overall backup and continuity solution. You know, I think a lot of times when we think about backup or we think about DR, we think about that one product that's actually, you know, the application doing that. But the reality of it is, I mean, you have an entire stack that's building this solution for you. And in a lot of cases, you have a different vendor and a different product for every part of this stack. And this is where the finger pointing comes in. So when we think about just the on-premise piece on the lower half, right, obviously you're going to have compute and memory in your servers that need to be sized and tuned properly to be able to run your backup application. There's going to be storage involved, and sometimes the storage can be external. It can be connected through a NAS, so now you have another network hop there, and ultimately yet another vendor on the storage side. A lot of folks, they could be just running the backup software on bare metal. A lot of folks these days will often have a hypervisor and run it as a virtual machine. So now you have a hypervisor layer in there as well. Then, of course, the OS. Much of the competitive solutions that are out there today, those vendors are still traditional Windows-based backup software. And then you have, obviously, the backup application itself. That's a lot that goes into a solution that I think sometimes we take for granted how much is actually built into that one component of the solution. And what's interesting now is that with cloud becoming such a big part of continuity, it adds a completely new layer of complexity. to the solution, right? And it does need to be accounted for. You're not just buying backup software, you're building an entire solution that is ultimately involving sometimes multiple sites. And in a lot of cases, you might, if you're going towards cloud, you're handing a lot of that secondary site infrastructure and management over to somebody else, right? It all has to work. And that's something obviously that we all need to consider when we're building these solutions. And that's obviously where a lot of the finger pointing can occur. So why does it occur, right? Of course, there are a lot of vendors involved, but you know, ultimately, what's driving this, right? Is it hatred between the vendors and everybody wants to make sure that it's not their fault? And of course not. I actually don't believe that. I think that most vendors actually really want to help their customers, and they do try to work together. It's just not always effective. Now, of course, I mean, there are some definite outlier situations where you might have a couple of vendors that are just very strict in how they work with others, and, you know, if certifications and support contracts aren't perfectly aligned, then they may just say, listen, go pound sand, right? That obviously really stinks for all of you. But I think that most vendors out there really do want to make sure you're taken care of, and they're willing to work together to try to give you the best experience that they can. But the reality is it's just not always effective, right? Some of the common causes that you're going to see here, whether you want to work really hard or not, lack of product integration between these vendors can cause bottlenecks, and awareness of those bottlenecks, especially as you start thinking about cloud being involved here, they just become very difficult for two vendors to come together and really get to a conclusion very fast. Second component is monitoring, and notice that I point out proactive monitoring. It's not just monitoring in general, but being proactive about it. When you think about hardware and software coming together in an integrated solution versus bringing that and integrating it together yourself, as issues kind of arise in your environment, proactive monitoring of the hardware or the software or that solution together as a whole can ultimately help you fend off problems that become a big issue for you later. And when you have multiple solutions bringing those together, the overall solution becomes harder to understand and predict when issues may occur in advance. And lastly, best practices. Right, sizing, the configuration, the tuning, all of that is actually takes skills, expertise, and time. Right, I think a lot of folks I talk to on the phone have plenty of skill, plenty of expertise. They've been doing backup for a really long time. But in most cases these days, with the changing technology and demands put on them, they just don't have or want to spend the time on this sort of thing. And to be honest, some people can inherit backup and they're not an expert, and they want something that's ultimately an approach that's just going to be, you know, insanely simple. And understanding all the best practices between vendors, they may not always be documented well. You may not be able to find that documentation very well. You may not be able to adhere to them due to other internal reasons. Well, whatever that is, that can create situations where obviously you have more issues, and that can result in backup vendor finger pointing. So all solutions, are they created equal, or are there some that have a higher potential for finger pointing than others? So I actually feel bad for this slide because it kind of seems like I'm calling out Microsoft. I'm actually not. What I'm bringing up here is really Windows-based backup software, right? It's not a knock on Microsoft specifically. It's really that in Windows executable style of backup software deployment that's not evil. It's still very popular, but it's also very popular because it's difficult for vendors to really make that switch. And you see a lot of newer vendors these days that are entering the market and doing newer things around backup and continuity are focusing on secure, hardened Linux-based solutions. So a few reasons why. Why do I think, you know, Windows executable software is a little bit more prone to finger pointing? So let's look at another version of software that's out there, virtual appliances. These are pretty popular. You see that across the board in many solutions these days in the data center. Most virtual appliances are hardened Linux lockdown environments that basically you just deploy as a virtual machine, so they're easy to set up. Whereas Windows, obviously, you're still kind of setting up in Windows by itself, either from a template or setting it up on your own from scratch. And there's obviously a lot of additional configuration items that you would need to handle to make sure that it's complying with your company and organization's configuration policies. And that can ultimately lead to, you know, more malware and security risks. Ransomware is big. Windows just tends to be targeted more, hit more, and just has a much more difficult process to keep it up to date, in line, and highly secure. It's not that Windows can't be highly secure, it can, but it is difficult to keep it that way. And then the other pieces are obviously, the OS and app are delivered together in a virtual appliance versus, a Windows executable. So that's less tuning, less optimization, less integration you have to do yourself. And then, of course, when we start thinking about the cloud piece, a lot of the Windows executable software, I haven't run into too many of those folks that that have clouds of their own that kind of extend the cloud for full purpose-built continuity. Cloud integration is kind of rampant across the board, but you're also going to see capabilities that vary widely across vendor to vendor when it comes to cloud and DRAS. So I think the next question to ask me is what types of solutions actually eliminate finger pointing, right? And here's where you're going to expect a shameless plug around Unitrans, but I'm actually not going to do that yet. The truth is that there aren't any that completely eliminate finger pointing. Not completely anyway. When we think about that backup and continuity stack, and as it extends to secondary sites, the network is almost always somebody else, right? And you got not only network hardware providers, but also network services, ISPs, things like that get into the mix. And there is obviously some troubleshooting that needs to occur between your backup vendor, even if they handle that whole stack with networking, which is obviously a core part of it. So you never get completely there, but you can get close to being there, right? And obviously what you want to look for to mitigate some of these issues around networks are solutions that have good network monitoring built in, WAN acceleration, hardening of that network connection, security of that network connection, throttling to make sure that you're obviously not overloading production, all that kind of stuff. And honestly, a lot of backup vendors these days have a lot of this. I think the big thing you want to consider when you're looking for these features is how do they get deployed and how do they get configured, right? Some folks might make you deploy multiple machines to get features like WAN acceleration, and now that's more best practices, more sizing, more Windows executables, more management, more security, all those things come into play when you start disaggregating these components. So, I do think that there's still a stance here that this idea around all-in-one enterprise backup and continuity, you want to look for solutions that can encompass all of that in a very simple, scalable way. And this slide, I think, is a great depiction of what you typically see here between everything we just talked about and where we're going, right? The old world has more vendors involved in that solution stack, which leads to more finger pointing and more management. The setup and time to value, it takes longer. You have to do manual integration, and you're constantly tuning that over time. The third piece here around limited continuity or little or no recovery assurance, this is really around capabilities, right? I think capabilities are starting to advance in this space, and you want to obviously look for vendors that are getting ahead of the game in terms of delivering more automation and more functionality around recovery that's both on-premise and in the cloud versus just something that might be good with the cloud and lack on-premise integration, which can obviously be a pretty big headache for you when you're babysitting backups all the time, or vice versa. And of course, we talked about Windows. Don't need to dig into that one too much more, but that's still where obviously a lot of vendors live today. Even ones that call themselves modern have still built a very traditional Windows-based architecture. And all of this leads to fragmented support that involves multiple calls, lower customer satisfaction. It doesn't matter if one component of that solution has great customer satisfaction. If there are failing issues across other parts of that stack and you have one vendor within that stack that happens to be a little bit less in terms of their customer satisfaction, that impacts the entire solution. So you want to think about solutions, not point products within the solution. And we know where we are in the new world, right? One vendor, one throat to choke. It's a very easy, simple time to value by just rack connecting and go. And of course, making sure you have the breadth around the local piece, physical and virtual, and cloud continuity, along with recovery assurance, which I'll talk about more, which has to do with a lot of, again, automation capabilities around making sure that you're just confidently aware that recovery will happen successfully. And then, of course, the security piece and the support piece we've kind of beat here. And we think that's ultimately where this transition from the old world to new world is around all-in-one enterprise backup and continuity. And when we talk about the approach, it really drives a level of simplicity that you can't get from the traditional Windows-based backup software approaches, right? This new approach is a fully integrated box. I take that entire stack, and I basically just rack a box up and I go. And by the way, something to consider here is the flexibility of vendors like this as well. So you can look at some vendors in the space that might only have 2 or 3 backup appliance models. Well, that's pretty limiting, right? And that's one of the reasons why a lot of people do like software, is that flexibility in how they can configure their hardware, because they can control cost a little bit better by building a hardware environment that is more suitable to their size. And that's, I think, where Unitrans kind of sets apart, is that Unitrans actually has 12 models that scale from basically a terabyte all the way up to almost 200 terabytes in a single box. And of course, you can scale out and manage centrally, but that idea is that we do give you a plethora of models that help fit your need, and that's something else you want to consider when you're looking at vendors like this. But really, the new approach is has pre-built connectivity and management of your data, also in a purpose-built continuity cloud, right? There's very little setup and ongoing management. You put the box in, it connects to the cloud almost automatically. There's a couple of steps, and off you go. Now, I did use a term there that was important, right? Purpose-built continuity cloud. Now, Unitrans actually does support Azure and AWS for cloud integration today, but when we're talking about finger pointing between vendors within that backup and continuity stack, one way to reduce that is to find a vendor that has their own cloud service, one that's purpose-built for off-site compliance, long-term retention, and fast failover. Right, so that's where you get into this old world and new world again, right? If you start looking at third-party cloud vendors, they're not bad. Again, we integrate with them, but there's less control there, more support calls. We all know support from some of those cloud providers is very, very minimal in some cases too, right? It might be online only to an extent. And capabilities are being built out over time with the integration into those cloud providers. Unitrans has some really cool AWS and Azure automation capabilities with another product we have. But when we think about that full backup and continuity strategy, you're ultimately seeing many fewer capabilities around DRAS as well, DR as a service, especially also around recovery assurance, proving that it's all going to work. And when it comes to retention, you're going to pay for every gigabyte that's stored in the cloud. You pay for the data that comes back out of the cloud. And hyperscale cloud providers don't give you any SLAs. They're not going to say, oh, I'm sorry, it took so long to recover, here's some money back. They don't ever do that, right? And that's where when you do get a purpose-built solution, again, no finger pointing, less management, single vendor, covering physical and virtual environments is critical. A lot of times you still get pigeonholed into just virtualization for a lot of these advanced features around DR as a service, and that includes recovery assurance. But having a great service around infinite retention that doesn't force you to pay for every gigabyte that's stored out there. You only pay based on what you protect on premise. And actually having a real SLA, somebody putting in writing for you that you're going to recover within an hour, and leveraging recovery assurance, we can prove that to you. So all those things are kind of where things are moving from the old world to the new world. And those are a lot of the gaps that are filled by having a purpose-built cloud from your backup and continuity vendor. Again, focusing on all-in-one. So I talked about recovery assurance a couple times here just to clarify a little bit more. Old world, new world, again, great way to kind of lay this out, right? You're typically praying that things are going to work successfully, and this is on-premise as well. It's not just about DR. It's making sure backups work. I think a lot of folks have been hit by, VMware change block tracking issues, and backup vendors can't do anything about that. It's an API issue within VMware, and here's finger pointing, right? I'm already finger pointing at VMware, but what Unitrans will do is take ownership of that and say, well, you know what, it's up to us to try to make sure that these backups work. So rather than you having to pray for that, we'll actually give you automation capabilities that'll actually go and test recovery. And not just the recovery of the data, but actually recovery of full applications, multi-tiered applications, spinning them up, making sure they work together. You can do that on premise. But of course, very popular is around DR, right? Folks typically are not testing DR because it's very manual and painful to do. And reporting on that from a compliance perspective, especially if you're in a high compliance industry, very painful and time consuming. People don't want to spend time on those types of activities. They want to spend time on driving production value into the organization. And recovery assurance from Unitrans automates that entire process, very proactively able to uncover issues as a result. Again, it spans physical and virtual, and automates reporting for full DR compliance, and all this is available local at your own secondary site for DR or in the Unitrans cloud. So here I am making a lot of claims, and we're talking about all-in-one and how that reduces vendor finger pointing. So an honest question to me might be, can you prove, that there's really a trend here? How do you validate it, right? I think one good point of validation is that, for starters, purpose-built backup appliances, they're growing more than double the rate of traditional backup software today. But I think what's even more impactful, in my opinion anyway, is that just about everybody wants in these days, right? You're seeing that your traditional software vendors are feeling the pain that purpose-built backup appliances are bringing to their overall business. And they're seeing undoubtable demand for more solution integration out of the box, right? And it just goes to everything we're talking about here. You want to be able to spend more time on production and not integrating backup. And therefore, a lot of vendors are kind of making the switch, or at least kind of making that shift to start adding these capabilities. So now you're going to have more choices. And, how can I ultimately, how can you make sure that a vendor provides that true all-in-one experience? Well, there are a few surface-level all-in-one requirements I think that help kind of evaluate one vendor to the next. First one is, we're talking about finger pointing here. Look for a true single-vendor appliance solution. Look for Linux-based solutions. Anything Windows-based forces additional integration and other vendors involved with Windows, obviously, and Microsoft. And naturally, again, public cloud integration with hyperscale clouds like AWS and Azure, it's all great. But we talked about some of the limitations, and if we're talking about true all-in-one here and eliminating finger pointing to the best you can, you're looking for somebody that can offer their own cloud services. So if we take and evaluate some of those new traditional vendors moving into this space, how do they kind of rank against those three key areas, right? Let's look at multiple vendors, for instance. Acronis was on that list. Acronis provides appliances through Dell that you can purchase through Dell or them, and they're built on VMware, and you're responsible for all VMware licensing that's involved. So they're shrinking the stack a little bit, but not really. You still have Dell, you still have VMware involved. Commvault. Commvault came out with an appliance that leverages NetApp as a part of their partner. So you're still not getting one throat to choke at this point. Now, many of these vendors are also still Windows-based. Commvault's Windows-based, ArcServe, Quest and Dell, Acronis. It's difficult to change the inner workings of a backup application and just say, okay, I'm going to be Linux-based now. And that's one of the shifts that's happened, and you see in the newer vendors and new entrants in the space, where Linux is obviously a key underpinning of there. And the benefits are starting to show when you see the amount of risk that's been out there and the amount of issues people have been having with ransomware and things like that. And on the cloud side of things, having that purpose-built continuity cloud. Commvault doesn't, neither does Quest or Dell. And out of that list, if I summarize it all, give you that nice one-pager, you can see here that when you start looking at kind of these top 5 new world items around all-in-one enterprise backup and continuity, it becomes pretty easy to start seeing who can live up to that very well and who doesn't. And I think that's pretty important because you're looking at some good vendors on the right-hand side. It's not like they're bad vendors. It's just that, and there are more vendors in this space. I understand this isn't the entire landscape, but what I'm showing here is that people are trying to get into this space because they're feeling the pain, and it's very difficult to just kind of jump into it. And I'm just trying to help folks understand that there are some key criteria you want to look for in an all-in-one enterprise backup and continuity appliance. So what else? We just hit kind of the top 5. I think those are great. But there are, some specific capabilities you want to look for as well when you dig into, some vendors that may have, those top 5 kind of at least seemingly met on the surface. So in this chart, just explaining it a little bit. So Recovery Series is the brand name for the Unitrans physical appliance. And naturally, it integrates with the Unitrans cloud. Unitrans backup software is a virtual appliance that deploys on VMware, Hyper-V, or Citrix Zen server. And it also can integrate with the Unitrans cloud. And then we look at kind of traditional Windows-based backup software. Now, obviously, the playing field looks uneven here. right? This is someone from Unitrans speaking, so, you know, I always think it's good for people to do their own evaluations, get third-party input, all that stuff. But something that is absolutely legitimately true when you start to look at the different approaches that these three columns represent. The software can help a little bit, like we talked about on the other side, on the hardening and the ransomware attacks and things like that. You start to get the fully integrated and optimized operating system and software, the cloud storage and DRaaS integration, and of course things like being able to do instant recovery to a hypervisor, which, to be honest, you know, most vendors can do, you know, some form of instant recovery these days. They just may not have all the hypervisors built into it. But I do think recovery assurance for physical and virtual machines is another area where both, you know, Unitrans, whether it's software or hardware, we give a little bit more of an edge to folks that are over just using Windows-based backup software. But now, so I think when you look at this, the Unitrans backup and our version of software with virtual appliances, I think it's still better, and it's always valid in some cases, right? We know that folks don't deploy all-in-one appliances 100% of the time. We absolutely know that, and that's why Unitrans is flexible around deployment, and we have software. We try to make that software as all-in-one as we can make it, and I think that's important. But when you do integrate the hardware into the solution, for the recovery series as an example, or another vendor that has an integrated appliance, what you want to look for is additional recovery and confidence benefits that go along with it. Right, so I think one of the key ones is being able to actually do recovery onto the appliance itself. That's something that not every vendor is able to give you, so Unitrans can give you that. Solving hardware problems before you know about them with predictive analytics and support monitoring. So something that's very, very prevalent within the Unitrans community is that when a hard drive fails, we've actually been alerted and shipped the drive out to the end user, and they didn't even realize it had failed. And then we call them, open up a support case for them, and we proactively addressed an issue that they never knew they had. That's something that you can get when you integrate the hardware and software together, but you need a company that provides the support infrastructure and processes to add that additional value. And there are things like programs that help making, help managing obsolescence be much more cost effective. So that pledge program you see there, so that's basically, you know, after year 4, we'll automatically swap your box out for the same size or bigger for free. So we kind of help put you in a program to manage that obsolescence around hardware. And then obviously, very obviously, it's all one support call across the hardware and software. So those are some things I think you want to look out for as you dig into appliances and other vendors around this. If you're kind of buying into that all-in-one approach, and you do want to, you know, reduce vendor finger pointing, not everybody's created equal in terms of the appliance problem. So naturally, that's a lot. I can't repeat it all, but in quick summary, just wrapping up here, finger pointing is inevitable with traditional software solutions and certain appliance vendors. The key is not to be fooled by some of the false one throat to choke sort of messages that are out there. All-in-one in a lot of cases doesn't always mean all-in-one. You definitely want to check into that. And hopefully I helped you understand a few areas that you can dig into. Eliminating, and really the reality is reducing, because you can't 100% eliminate it, but eliminating finger pointing really takes kind of a new approach to things. That all-in-one enterprise backup and continuity approach is something that it's not brand new in the market, but you don't see many vendors really able to completely offer that. They typically lack in capabilities or service offerings to really be able to give you that full all-in-one benefit. And that's the culmination of all this, is to solve this, you know, look for those true all-in-one solutions. So wrapping up, if you want to get more information, see things for yourself, start learning more about Unitrans and what we can offer. We do have free trials available for all of our software. And we also have free evaluations of our recovery series appliance. And the reason I pointed out free trials of software is because if you want to just kick the tires in terms of functionality, you can do that with a virtual appliance in your environment. If you want to take advantage, even at the trial stage, of the full all-in-one capabilities around hardware and software integration with a recovery series, we can do that as well. We can ship those out and let you try them. And some folks just like to, you know, learn a little bit more with a demo. That's available. We have on-demand as well as live demos that you can set up, and you can always talk to us whenever you want. And I think for a limited time here, till the end of February, something that's important to note is if you get involved in one of those trials, whether it's downloading Unitrans backup or submitting a trial for recovery series, go to the website, do that, get going quickly, and you have the opportunity to win a Dream Lab for your home that is $5,000 or more. And depending on the organization, if you're working for small businesses, sometimes that can be more robust than some of the infrastructure you might have in your office. So it's a nice treat. I think it's worth getting involved. Start looking at Unitrans pretty quickly here, and fill out a form to do one of those evaluations or trials, and you're automatically entered for a chance to win. So Kevin, at this point, I think I will turn it over to you for any of the Q&A.
Sounds good, Joe. Thank you so much. Great presentation. Before we get started in the Q&A, there's still time to ask questions. You can do so by typing them into the bottom right-hand side of the player. And let's get started here. So the first question is, if I buy my entire solution from one reseller and they integrate it for me, isn't that all in one?
So good. Somebody's looking to poke holes, and I like that. I don't look at it that way, and here's why. So just because you go through CDW or somebody like that, and you're able to purchase your backup hardware, your storage, your backup software, and you might even be able to get, Azure resold services from them. That's great. You have one invoice, one PO, one point of purchase. But that's not a one vendor solution, right? That you still ultimately are on the hook to manage and tune that over time and have that supported through one vendor. And even if you were to leverage kind of an MSP approach where you have something fully managed where you do only have one support call to that one partner, they still have multiple vendors to deal with on the back end. That still has an impact on you. It has an impact on your downtime. It has an impact on issue resolution. And ultimately, it's still going to have you worrying about whether or not backups are functioning.
Okay. Next question is, can't finger pointing occur with backup vendors in VMware, Windows, and other applications too? How do you prevent that? So one of the key points about the stack that we talked about, and even this presentation when you dig into it, when we talk about backup vendor finger pointing, we're talking about that backup stack. And I admitted that when you start thinking about secondary sites, the network becomes something that you can't really get all in one vendor. That's a great point. What's brought up here is that, okay, but you also have other vendors that you need to integrate with in order to do the backups, whether on the production side. That could be production storage, it could be production hypervisors, or OSs or applications themselves. And you're right, things like VSS, things like the VMware APIs that I mentioned before, all those things require you to integrate there, and you do need vendors that ultimately can work well, be a part of the proper technology alliance programs, and have great support structures between the two vendors to make sure that ultimately when issues arise, your backup vendor can solve those efficiently and quickly, even though we may have to rely on another vendor on the production side. So you're absolutely right. The point here was about backup vendor finger pointing within that stack, but within the production stack, we have to integrate with other vendors, and we got to make sure that we do that well. I think the key there is just make sure you're looking at vendors that integrate with best practices. They can integrate flexibly, meaning that, in a VMware environment, it's not all just about integrating with the VMware APIs for data protection, but also being able to meet your needs where you might actually have to do some guest level protection and get more granular into a VM than what the VMware APIs can do. So flexibility is key there as well. And when you start looking at the flexible piece, at that point in that example, I would need to integrate really well with Windows and VSS and things like that to make sure that I'm doing, guest level backups of Windows very well. Same thing with the applications like SQL Exchange, SharePoint, Oracle, and even Linux machines, even Unix machines, if you got those out there. So yeah, you look for vendors that truly can leverage flexible and best practice means of integrating with that production environment, because you can't help the fact that your backup stack is going to have to integrate with those production vendors. Okay. Question is, are there any new pricing policies to be aware of?
So it sounds like an existing customer question around what we, or a partner that's looking to see if we're changing any pricing around any of this new messaging. So today all the pricing is actually available on the website for Recovery Series and for Unitrans backup software. Nothing's changed for those for a while. And same thing with Unitrans Cloud. We don't have that pricing on the website, but naturally you can work with your Unitrans rep or your partner if you're a customer. And understand the pricing there. That hasn't changed in a little while either. We always review pricing periodically to stay competitive, create differentiation, create more value for our partner community and for our customers, and be able to deliver more for what we believe is better value to you. So always stay tuned, and it's a great question to ask here on the webinar. I don't have anything to report in terms of anything brand new recently.
Okay. What type of retention can I expect in the Unitrans Cloud?
Good question. I didn't run through the retention policy there. We glossed over it pretty quickly. So the Unitrans Cloud has a built-in grandfather, father, son retention policy. So we'll keep 7 dailies, 4 weeklies, 12 monthlies, and an infinite number of yearly backups for you in the cloud. If you need to keep less, we easily can adjust for onboarding purposes. But that's the default retention policy, and again, there's no management whatsoever required by you to manage that. So you're not rotating tapes, you're not managing special jobs, you're not managing additional schedules, anything along those lines for your retention. So it's fully hands-off from your perspective on the customer side.
Okay. How much is the cost per gigabyte in the Unitrans Cloud versus AWS?
So good question. The pricing policies between the Unitrans Cloud and AWS are actually very different, right? So when you look at a cost per gigabyte of AWS, it's going to be the cost for every gigabyte stored in AWS. So think about, typically you don't get great deduplication with vendors that are actually sending data out to AWS, but think about all the retention that we just talked about for a few years that you would need, the number of full backups that it would store, and typically, again, the lack of efficiency you often see with solutions integrating with AWS. You're going to, while AWS might be as low as 1.5 cents for the infrequent access storage, and it's about 3 cents or so, 2.5 maybe for your standard S3. It tends to obviously add up very, very quickly, and anytime you're doing recoveries and pulling data out, that's big as well. So on the Unitrans side, we actually charge by protected capacity. So what you have in your environment, if you have if you have a terabyte of data, you pay based on that terabyte of data. And the retention builds and builds and builds, and you're not paying any more for any of that retention. You're just paying based on what we're protecting on-premise, the amount of data there. So the cost per gigabyte is going to look skewed where Unitrans is going to look higher, but we're not charging for retention, and we're not charging for getting data out. And if you want to reach out to us offline and see some numbers behind that, we actually have a really cool cost comparison calculator, as well as a blog that has a detailed table that compares the overall TCO of Unitrans Cloud versus AWS and Google and folks like that. And you'll actually see that even though the hyperscale clouds are designed to be cheap, Unitrans can overall deliver a much better TCO when it comes to offsite compliance, long-term retention, and a full backup and continuity solution.
Okay, last question, and then we'll wrap it up. We're just about out of time here. Can Unitrans back up VMs that run in Microsoft Azure?
Yes, yeah. So that was actually something that was pretty new. So you might be an Azure partner or focused on, building out new infrastructure in the cloud. Unitrans is still a great option for that. We can deploy in Azure right through their marketplace. You can deploy agents on those machines. You can back them up. And guess what? The Unitrans Cloud is still an option there, right? So while you're not able to completely eliminate vendor fingerpointing because you have Azure in the mix there, we're an Azure partner. We like the Microsoft folks. We like Azure. We understand the move to the cloud. And what we're prescribing here is not that all-in-one is always going to be the 100% best approach because you might be moving to cloud infrastructure. And there's a production, virtual machine infrastructure as a service living out there in the cloud. But we can ultimately still give you as much of that all-in-one experience as possible because we can run out there, we can centrally manage with on-premise, and we can still integrate with the Unitrans cloud if you want to actually do failover outside to another cloud.
Okay. Well, thanks, everybody. As a reminder, this webinar was recorded, and you'll receive a link with an email with a link to the on-demand version so that you can view it again if you choose to do so. And we'll also be contacting the $100 Amazon gift card winner via email later today or tomorrow. Thanks again for joining us, and we look forward to having you on future webinars. Take care, everybody.
Great, thanks.